Helen Ingram and Gwynn Laird Benner are doing the interview, and the date is September 24th, 2010. Dick, I came to your presentation yesterday. Richard, all right. Richard, I came to your presentation. That was my one mistake. I've always said Richard before. I came to your presentation yesterday, and you said you had become a botanist when you were 8 years old.
Yeah, I was a marine biologist first.
That's what you said. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how you chose this area. And I note that your dissertation was written about the Sonoran Desert. How did you get into that? What made this important?
Well, let's narrow that down a little bit. You mean how did I first get into botany, or why I came here to the Sonoran Desert, University of Arizona?
How about both?
Both. Well, we lived at the beach in California, and so naturally as a kid I was interested in the sea creatures, and I had my pet octopi in my room, and by mutual agreement, when I was a little kid, my room was out in the garage, because that's where my dog and my octopuses and sea urchins and are we still there?
Yep, we're fine.
Okay, and so low tide, I was out on the tide pools. High tide, then I would go up into the mountains right behind us, and that was in the days when the coast of Southern California, you could hike in the mountains and find natural vegetation. And I kind of remember, I think I was about 8 years old, maybe even younger, but someone gave me some cactus and succulent plants, and of course I wanted to know all the names of them. And my father, being a doctor, was not able to tell me, and my mother, of course, had no idea. And so one thing led to another, and I finally got somebody took me down to the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles, and I remember very kindly old Dr. Hill, and I had found some specimens that were very, very much of interest to him, and he was able to give me names for everything. And I'm talking about the sea creatures, and then I got onto books and identified plants and started growing them, and I'm still growing plants and so forth.
How about the Sonoran Desert?
Well, the Sonoran Desert. When I was in high school, I hung out with, today they'd be called ecology nerds, but we didn't know the word nerd then. And I had a beloved high school teacher, Nancy Thomas Neely. And we would go out in the afternoons in her car, and we'd go out to the tide pools or go out to the desert. This is from Los Angeles. And one spring, a bunch of us decided that we were going to go to Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument so that I could see some of the plants that I had only seen growing as specimens, such as when I would make pilgrimages to the Huntington Library Botanic Gardens, or I'd see in books or herbarium specimens. And I can tell you this is rather funny. My parents, well, actually my mother, because my father didn't. My father, he thought everything was fine, and but my mother was always concerned. So my mother and some other kids' parents called up the Auto Club. They said, well, there's no need for them to go to Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. There's nothing there. And we won, and we went. And we got some older kids, some college students drove, because I knew it was before the days I was driving. And it was like, I don't know how to explain it, but it was just like the whole world had opened up. And at about that time, I also made a field trip with some UCLA grad students. They were Dr. Raymond Cole's student. Dr. Raymond Cole's, when I was in high school, I would go to his classes. I'd in fact, I would cut high school classes. In fact, my high school teachers knew I was doing that, and I would go to sit in on classes at UCLA. And they made a field trip down to Ensenada and a little further south. And I got to see what was then known as Macarius gomosus. Now we know it as Stenoceros gomosus, or Pitaya agria. It's a sprawling cactus. And then we went on and we saw the giant cardone cactus. And, well, one thing, I don't think that at that point, I knew where the good stuff was. And then one Christmas vacation, Nancy Neely and her boyfriend, and they later got married, Peter Neely, and some other people who were working on hibernating poor wills, made a trip to Alamos. And there's where I really saw where the good stuff was. Went from desert, we went through Organ Pipe, we went through the Sonoran Desert. I got to see the whole change, and got to see the transition from the Sonoran Desert to the tropical thorn scrub to the tropical deciduous forest, where bromeliads and orchids, and we ascended the Sierra de Alamos and saw cycads, Dione sonorensis, and so there wasn't any question that this was the part of the world. It was far more interesting than Los Angeles. And then I was encouraged to apply to all of these, well, I shouldn't say this, but probably at that time, more respectable universities. Yes. It was also, everyone seemed to think that the doctor's son, that I would be interested in medicine. Well, there's no way in hell I was interested in medicine after seeing my father, seeing all the sick people that he had to deal with. And he was a surgeon, and I really had no interest in seeing the insides to see people's guts. And so I quickly realized the University of Arizona was geographically the closest to the good stuff. And there was plenty of good stuff even here around Tucson. I remember coming here, driving all night to get to the University of Arizona, registering, and that very same day, hightailing it down to Sycamore Canyon, where there's a population of Tillandsia recurvata, a bromeliad, the only bromeliad in the Southwest. And so I was here. Kitty Parker was then the curator of botany, the curator of the herbarium, and she was sort of like Nancy Neely, very different in morphology, but she just kind of welcomed me, and I hung out at the herbarium, and we went on field trips. I went on field trips with Joe Marshall to the Sierra Madre, and I kind of thought I was in heaven. And then every so often I'd have to go to classes.
Okay.
So maybe that's more than what you wanted to hear.
No, it's not at all more than I want to hear. But so get us yet to the Pinnacottes.
Oh, the Pinnacotti? Well, that was later. My first interest truly was not so much desert, but the origins of desert. I was interested. I had read Forrest Shreve's publications, every single one of them. I still have those books. And I was interested really where the tropical plants were. I thought I was really interested in tropical botany because I had grown orchids and cycads, and the house where we lived when I was a kid, finally my mother had, finally my euphorbias and cycads, and finally smothered out the last of the roses. But I had grown all these plants, and so those areas were my first interest. But then I kind of I realized, after reading more of Forrest Shreve's works,
Shreves.
Forrest Shreve, yes.
Okay.
And unfortunately, he died before I came here. But I had read everything that he had written. And some years after I had been here for a while, I was taken on a field trip to the Pinacate. Of course, the Pinacate is essentially on the other side of Organ Pipe, and I would go to Organ Pipe frequently. And some of my earliest field trips were even to Quito. And you may have known that some years later I published a paper with Gary Nabhan on the botany and ethnobotany of Quito, which is one of the longest occupied water holes or oases in the desert, the Sonoran Desert. And in those days, we would drive along the Mexican highway, and hop across the fence to Quito. And would always stop at the Organ Pipe headquarters and ask how the road was, and they say, "Oh, the road's terrible. You better go on the Mexican side and just hop over the fence." That's what we do all the time. And I continued to do that until probably a little too late, years and years later, when the last time I did that, I saw in the early morning some bags of value-added agricultural products hanging on the fence, and I decided that was enough of that. And then into the Pinacate, one of my earliest trips was with Julian Hayden. And of course, I just thought that was a fascinating place, and I started collecting plants. You know, in some of those first trips, I went with other people who were not botanists, and they were hiking and doing the sorts of things that people did in those days that are now illegal. And I would be collecting plants and pressing plants, and they were pretty tolerant of me. And those were, of course, identifying plants was not as easy as it is now. And I would come back to the University of Arizona and spend days identifying the plants that I had collected. And one thing led to another, and eventually I published the flora of the Pinacate in northwestern Mexico.
Tell me a little bit about how you got to know Gary Nabhan, and then I want to ask you a little bit about Julian.
Okay. Well, Gary, I knew Gary when he was a seedling. I guess I would say a sapling. And I can't remember how I first met Gary, but our interests were in poetry and some of our mutual poet friends.
Are you still there, Gwynn? Oh, sorry. You go ahead and tell your story, and I'll get Wendy.
Well, I'll wait.
Okay. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're not in trouble. Yeah, we're fine. It's just you went off for a minute, or the machine went up.
Okay, well, Gary, I worked with, let's see, after I left here, I was briefly at the University of Colorado. Then I was senior curator of botany at the Natural History Museum, Los Angeles. And then I left Los Angeles and moved back to Tucson. And that's when I met Gary Nabhan, and our interests were just mutual. Gary was just starting out. In fact, I think it's fair to say he got his start with me.
Okay.
And Gary was writing poetry, and we both had poet friends, and I shared a lot of the poetry and things with friends of mine.
Okay, I'm sure
Michael McClure and Gary Snyder. And then Gary's, in fact, Gary, the woman that I was with at the time, in fact, we rented a little guest house to Gary. And at that time, there were a number of fallout, really great scientists, ecologists, the fallout from Prescott College.
Ah,
Gary Nabhan. Then I met Kim Clifton. We worked with sea turtles. Amadeo Rea was an instructor, and more of the fallout from Prescott College, and the list goes on.
okay. We were writing this article, and we thought that there are at least two generations of scholars, and one of them being Julian Hayden, and the people who sort of were introduced to the desert through him and people like him. There's also some people who were interested in the Gulf here at the University of Arizona who were really important. So, do you think that's
I think
right?
Wendy's trying to
Go
say.
ahead, Gwynn.
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm listening.
Okay. Oh, I had to back up and
Okay.
interrupt you.
Right.
The Pinacati.
All right.
On the earliest trips, I went with Ann Wooden and with Bill Wooden. And the real time when I really obtained most of the information that I've used, and I'm still mining that. I'm still mining the specimens and even the field notes. I went with Ann Wooden and her family, and we went to Tule Tank, and we stayed there for 6 weeks. And for 6 weeks, I didn't leave. Other people came and went, but I stayed there. And every day, I'd go out hiking and go somewhere else in the Pinacati, and sometimes overnight.
Can you sort of give me a rough time period for
I
this?
think that was the 70s,
Okay.
but I could be quite wrong on that. While other people were drinking and doing other things that we won't mention, I was in my little tent because of the wind. You have to be out of the wind for pressing plants. And I'd be pressing plants most of the night. I won't say any more, though. But we had a great time. And I covered the Pinacati. We went up to the top. One memorable time with the Woodens. Bill, of course, was working, and so it was Ann and the boys. Boys, I mean, they were growing up, but, they were Michael and Peter. And we went up to the top of the Pinacati, and everybody thought that someone else had brought the food. But luckily, we had stuff to drink, and found a water hole. And I went again to the Pinacati 17 years later, and again, everyone thought that everyone else had brought more water. And I said, well, I know where there's water. And they said, where? This is from the top. And I said, well, that's over there. But it's only 3 or 4 miles. Well, when were you there last? Oh, 17 years ago. But you don't forget those things.
No.
Yeah. So really, the Pinacati was, I owe that to Ann Wooden,
Okay.
who invited me to come with them. And Ann wrote a beautiful book, as you know about. And then from there, I met Julian Hayden, although I had known him before. And I made some memorable field trips with Julian.
What do you think about this idea of
a
looking at
little
people and how they get acquainted with the border and with the Sonoran Desert? Often it's through experience with the place and loving the place, and in your case, the plants. But it's also because they've had field experience, and they mentioned exactly field experience with a mentor who introduces them to things. And we see that going on today with people like Bill Shaw and his Mexican graduate students. Do you think we're on the right track here? Is that at least your experience, that it's the place and the people, and are there other people you'd like to mention?
Oh, yes, there are a lot of people. In the place, of course. For me, the interest in the Pinacati was, one, it was a fun place to go to. It was a fun place to go camping. And I could reach it on a weekend. That was also, that's the reality part. It's a place that was unspoiled, and it wasn't too wet. By then I had realized that things that are drier are often better. And it wasn't too wet, and the vegetation in Flora was really true desert.
Okay.
And people, I got to know it was later, because at the time when we first started working there wasn't anyone in Mexico that was working in the area. I had done a lot of field work elsewhere in Sonora with Mexican students from the University of Sonora. I had done I had been with worked with the Seris, traveled with them, Mexican fishermen. And most of my work in Sonora was not with academics until later, because there were not academics at the University of Sonora. It was very small then. And I did get to know the people there, but the people who were interested in the field were students, and they weren't necessarily botanists. I would go out to, I knew students, I'd go out to their parents' ranches, farms, go with Yaqui Indians, Mayos, go to Alamos. I spent a lot of time in Alamos with a fellow who lives there, and there are times when we go for a week or more by horse or by mule. In those days it was safe, or at least if it wasn't safe, I didn't know about it or care.
Yes, yes. Okay. I'm interested in your impressions of Mexico, and I just want to follow up on what you just said. Now, of course, it's a very different border, but how did you feel about that border crossing? Did it feel like a crossing, or did it just feel like
only when I had to come back and figure out some way to get my specimens across the border?
Okay.
It was a lot looser then, or I should say, I would say that agriculture inspectors had more leeway to make intelligent decisions. And I had a working arrangement with Nogales that I could bring my plants across at Sonoita, and I would give them a list and tell them what everything was. The things were put into the drying ovens here, and that worked.
Okay.
Or I would have to drive to Yuma, where there was an agriculture inspector, if I was bringing in things that I knew that should be inspected. As far as the border, there always has been illicit stuff going on, and you knew about it, and often you'd be in camp and someone would come by and you knew that those bags were not bags of specimens that they were going to be pressing. Mm-hmm. You knew those plants were only one species. And you'd invite them to have coffee with you, and you'd sit down and you'd talk, and wouldn't talk about what they were carrying, and they would go on. But those gentle times have passed.
Right. Have you had any recent experiences that could contrast with that might tell us a bit about the increased difficulty of getting your specimens over, or the impact of the wall or anything like that?
Well, there's lots of different issues there. As far as getting specimens across, it's much more formal, and you bring specimens through at certain points, certain places, and they're inspected, and there are no exceptions, or people are not allowed to make their own decisions. I kind of let that go now. I don't think we need to discuss too much of that.
Okay.
As far as the border, yes, it's all changed. I've become allergic to having pistols held to my head.
Would you say it's still possible for you to do your work?
Oh yes. But there's certain areas I don't go to anymore.
Uh-huh.
One could, if I had a reason, but in any place one would go now, you would only go with locals. Mm-hmm. But I'm doing a lot of work. I'm still working now. In fact, I'm back working again, not still, but back working with the series. And I'm working with some of the grandkids of the old folks that I worked with when I was a sapling, when I worked on the ethnobotany of the Seri. And And
So you'd say it's your personal relationships with people that have allowed you to continue to do many of the things
yes.
that you
Oh, almost.
that for a newcomer would be difficult.
Well, a newcomer should just get to know who the local people are, and things have changed vastly. What we haven't said now is in the Pinacati. Then later, I met Ezekiel Escura and Miguel Iquiwa and Jorge. The people who were working with Ezekiel. Mm-hmm. Also, the other thing is the University of Sonora has numerous biologists, ecologists now. There's and also the Northwest Station of the north of UNAM, of the Ecology Center. There are academic people in San Luis. Recent field trip to the delta of the Colorado River, working on Disticus palmeri. I went with people who are at some of the ecology and conservation NGOs in San Luis. There are, of course, we all know about Sado in Puerto Peñasco, and my first work in Sonora and along the border, those places weren't there. Those people weren't there. Of course, getting back to the Pinacati, we did know the ranching people, the ranchers. We would never go in without stopping to see the Bermudez family we would never go past any of the little ranches without stopping and having coffee and spending time talking to them for an hour or more, or as long as, you don't do that anymore. In fact, the Bermudez place has since come into the hands of drug smugglers, and so those times have changed. In fact, I met most of those people with Julian Hayden, and Julian knew all those people.
Could I then just follow up a little bit on this? We've interviewed 42 people, and I don't suppose you would be surprised how many of them mentioned your name. And one of them in particular said he thought it was very generous that you would spend your time walking with him and explaining things, and that experience he had was really formative to his later choices. I wonder, was that partly on your part, an attempt to do what Julian had done for you, or what is sort of this mentoring
I never
motivation?
thought about it.
Never thought about it, okay.
I thought that was just what people do.
Okay.
I don't know, if something that you're interested in, it's not work.
Okay. Can you tell us a little then about what you think the state of the field is? If you say when you first went there weren't Mexican biologists in the field, there weren't a lot of you. Is it true to say now that this is a well-populated field? Do you feel happy?
Oh, yeah, it's wonderful. It's great. I mean, there were some people. Of course, there were people in Mexico, but most of the researchers in Mexico were in Mexico City. Right. They were in Guadalajara, or they were over in Ensenada, yes, or La Paz. There were, it was sort of the outback. And the population, of course, of Sonora has just mushroomed, same as in Arizona. And the academic institutions have increased and have grown. And I would say the people working in the Sonoran Desert, that today I don't see any difference between the people who are in Mexico and the people who are here.
That's great.
There isn't any such thing as one side better, and I don't know of many people who don't collaborate. Okay. There, of course, are always curmudgeons, and there are always people who do their own thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think as far as research in the Sonoran Desert, it's almost as if the border isn't there. but it is there. And it's there, and it's very real now. There's those fences. I would say the border is militarized now. If you've crossed recently in Nogales,
Yes.
U.S. custom agents are all carrying guns. I think if I was working there, I'd probably carry a gun too. But I mean, it's dangerous work. But it is militarized, and
Well,
it's a very tragic situation. However, drugs crossing the border and contraband is nothing new. We used to, in the Pinacate, see things like big four-engine airplanes landing, and you knew to stay away. Fayucos were going to Mexico. Air conditioners, computers, refrigerators, and who knows what was coming back. You would see a huge airplane land out on some of those barren flats or near barren flats near the Sierra del Rosario, and then you'd see a truck drive up, and you'd see some activity, and then the truck would leave and the airplane would take off. And then we'd go back to our camp.
well, you sound optimistic, at least about the state of academic and scholarly and research interactions. Maybe research is the right way to say, between the United States and Mexico. How about the state of the resource? Do you think that we are better off for the establishment of all of these reserves and the knowledge that we've gathered about what's in those reserves that need protecting? And are you optimistic about that future, or do you think that the insults to the environment are accruing faster than our ability to protect?
All of the above.
Okay.
The reserves, Ezekiel Lascura, of course, has had a heavy hand
Right.
in formation of those reserves. I'm glad to say that I've been a part of some of the research that's led to it. Those reserves were not necessary when population was, frankly, minute. Although it would have been helpful to have them, because even with a small population, even with a very small population of Baja California, over the centuries, as Crouch pointed out, the loss of resources and biodiversity was immense, even with low population. However, the huge increase in population on both sides of the border and the development has made it absolutely essential that wherever possible, that reserves are carved out, and then the attempt to hold on to them.
Okay. Gwen, before I go any farther, Wendy, have we covered background enough?
Yeah, I was wondering though, have you, Richard, gone into the field and sort of evaluated the botany of the Pinacate since doing your original study to see what changes have occurred since the biosphere was established?
Well,
Is there any of that work going?
I'm not doing any formal work on that because I have so many other things going. But I have been back, of course, and pretty much there's not that much change. What change has occurred, some of the most fragile areas just being visited too much. Some of the water holes have been hammered. I'm not thinking just the Pinacate, but I'm thinking of both sides of the border, mostly, very largely due to the illicit traffic. And the border fence is a little overdone, but that has really, in some ways, helped. Of course, it stopped the interchange of the large animals unable to cross, but there are no longer road races across the desert. And a lot of that would originate in the Pinacate. And so the U.S. Border Patrol has stopped most of that. It's, of course, no longer wilderness along the border. And so while we're at it, I must say that I've also observed enormous sophistication for the better of agents on both sides of the border, but especially along the U.S. border. They don't just wantonly drive across the desert the way they used to, and there's much more professionalism. As far as the Pinacate, remember when we first were going there, very few people would visit the Pinacate. The interesting thing that I see, really exciting, in the reserve is that most of the visitors are now Mexican visitors, from people from Puerto Penasco and far away, and so places like Elegante Crater, there's a lot of traffic, but again, the people who are running those reserves have done a fairly good job at patrolling. But now we have the coastal highway that runs between the great Alto Golfo and the Pinacate Reserve, and that's going to have a huge impact. And so, and I haven't seen what's happened with that, and we probably won't see much impact until some years down the road. But the plants are still there. The megafauna, the large animals, are not able to migrate the way they used to. They can't. Highway 2 was a barrier. I think one of the most poignant things that really stuck in my mind, and I've never forgotten this, was seeing a magnificent ram standing on the side of Highway 2 waiting to cross, but the trucks were incessant truck traffic. And I don't think that ram was able to cross. And of course, the same thing with the pronghorn. And so even before the border fence, Highway 2, and it would just suck up animals. As you know, any road, especially a paved road, just sucks up reptiles, snakes, and then the rodent populations explode along anywhere close. So the changes I've seen, buffalo grass all along the highway, but once you get away from the highways, I don't see that there's been very much change. The building of the border fence, of course, created devastation, as we all know. Not just the fence itself, but the clearing of land and the smashing of vegetation to construct that fence. And of course the construction that had to go on to build the highway, the coastal highway. But also you realize that the Pinacate is the funnel. It's the only, it's the squeeze joint between Baja California and the rest of Mexico. And it's as if the United States had a wasp waste, as if Galveston and Ottawa were 25 miles apart.
Right.
Imagine.
And there's a lot that has to funnel through that, as you were pointing out.
Yeah, but again, as far as the vegetation of the plants, you only see the big changes today so far right along the highway, with some exceptions. A few invasive plants are able to carry fire. And so after an El Nino year, you get some invasive plants carrying fire, and the desert vegetation, as you know, is totally unadapted, has no adaptation to fire. And Tony Burgess has used the word grassification, or the Africanization of the Sonoran Desert, with introduced invasive plants, mostly a few species of grasses, red brome and buffalo grass. So you do see some of that in the Pinacate. You see some of that in Cabeza Prieta, in absolutely pristine areas. So those changes are not going away.
Okay. One more background question, if it's okay. I'm an academic, and I know a lot of them, and they tend to pursue pretty narrow agendas. They often are not very interested in practical, on-the-ground applications, and many botanists now don't really spend a lot of time with any kind of classification or communicating with real people. So your career seems...
I'm glad I'm not a real person.
Exactly.
I never thought I was.
Good. Well, I want to know how you got that way, because there's enormous pressures, especially for what was clear, a wonderful student. People guide you into certain directions. You began from the beginning, not going to UCLA or Berkeley, but instead coming to the University of Arizona. And you've stuck with one agenda for a very long time. Can you explain that? Somebody said that you're kind of one of a kind, of an old school. There's not that many people who do this anymore.
Well, I don't know if I agreed with that.
Okay.
I think, yeah, the way, of course, Otto Solberg at Harvard told me the way that you succeed in science is that you pick something for your graduate work. You pick a niche that is unfilled, a new ecological niche, or you make one,
Right.
and you continue doing that until you get better and better at it, and you specialize in it.
Right.
And that's really what a lot of science is based on. And so, to get tenure, to even get a tenure-track position, one has to be a specialist. It's probably why I'm largely a failure. But I see a lot of people today. The guy that I'm working with, Ben Wilder, who found me and sucked me into getting back onto the islands of the Gulf of California, all with lots of pleasure and fun. Students I'm working with now, many of them have a very broad view. I'd say many of them do. But to get a paying job,
Yes.
a position, one does have to have a specialty. And usually, and today, often, one can't afford until tenure to do what may not be the most fashionable. However, with all that said, if you know, National Science Foundation requires you to have outreach. If you're going to have a National Science Foundation grant, I don't know if it's for all fields, but you have to do some outreach. And I know right here we're sitting in this magnificent herbarium in Herring Hall. I know that Dr. McMahon, Shelley McMahon. I know that Phil Jenkins, who's here, and the other people associated. They all do. They all go to. They all give talks to non-academic organizations, Native Plant Society, Audubon. Not many people today, I think, are proud to be only in an ivory tower. Betsy Arnold, the curator of the Mycological Herbarium, right here upstairs, who is doing cutting-edge research, supported by National Science Foundation. I know that she does a lot of outreach. I know that she entertains students at all levels. And I think that today most people realize that there is such an obligation. But yes, you're right. There is a lot of specialization, and science marches on.
Yeah.
And to really make some of those, there's two things that are of interest. That those narrow fields in which you specialize in, you then occupy a niche that no one else has,
Right.
and you become the expert. If it's something that's of interest to a lot of people, then you are naturally communicating. However, if in any academic field, as you know, if you take different fields and you cross-pollinate between history and botany, or history and genomics, you can often then leap forward and get to another level. So Today, I think that you see science is so multifaceted. I mean, there are so many fields that did not even exist when we were students.
Okay, great. Can I then talk a little bit about how you transitioned your research into informing some of these political activities? And by political, I mean policy, like the establishment of the Pinacate Reserve, or your involvement in trying to create the International Peace Park.
Well, that's a kind of a loaded question, but any botanist, any field botanist, any field biologist, marine biology, et cetera, has been, everyone is witnessing the changes, and to know that you have to do something. As far as politics, I've long been involved. I was very thickly involved in the IUCN Survival Service Commission. I got into that. Actually, the series led me into that with the sea turtle situation. The sea turtle situation being so, it seemed so hopeless that I guess I got into pretty heavy-duty conservation. I guess you would call it political, international. At the time, there was zero conservation of sea turtles. Working with Kim Clifton, and Gary Nabhan was peripherally involved at that time. And that led to my being involved with the Survival Service Commission at a time when the United States was not willing to recognize sea turtles as being endangered. Mexico was not. That whole situation had changed. I remember going to my first meeting of that I went to, the Survival Service Commission in the Soviet, in the times of the Soviet Empire, in Ashgabat, and the entire world sea turtle conservation mafia was there, and we knew everybody. I recently went to a sea turtle symposium, and there were more than 1,000 researchers from all over the world, and the number of Mexican researchers is enormous. And there's where you really see some outreach. The people working on sea turtles, they're both sides of the board. Everyone is collaborating, and some of the young Seri kids are involved in sea turtle conservation. I hope that isn't a tangent, but
No, it isn't. It's not a tangent at all. That's great.
And in those days, by the way, I felt like I was talking to the wall or a mirror when I tried to interest IUCN Survival Service Commission with, quote, plants. Mm-hmm. There was no recognition in CITES for plants. That, of course, changed very quickly and very rapidly. So I've always been interested in conservation. I don't know how you could not be interested. And I think that, I guess now you're making me think about it, I would say that it was the people, when I was in the junior high school, at the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History, and Dr. Raymond Coles, who was originally from South Africa at UCLA. I think that those people who were interested in conservation, and I was. There wasn't any
no line between research and action in that sense.
I don't think there was. I mean, it was just something that you did. I mean,
Yeah.
You were interested in.
Okay, do you want to mention any other sort of environmental organizations that may have come into your orbit in this sort of pursuit at policy things? Are there collaborations with particular organizations? Obviously, you worked for the Desert Museum, which is a kind of an organization.
Well, it was through the Desert Museum that I was involved with the Survival Service Commission. At the Desert Museum, I founded the research department.
I know you did.
And it was a wonderful springboard, because people who would come through and you would meet them. And the other person is George Lindsay at the California Academy of Sciences. And although I never was privileged to go on any of their well-funded big ship expeditions to the islands, I always went out with fishermen and little pongas. But
You mentioned Sado. Of course, that's
Sado, but that came later.
Much more recent.
And the work in the Pinacate with I got hooked up with Ezekiel Luscura as a close friend, and but I had already been involved with the Survival Service Commission. But that started with sea turtles, not with plants.
Right. Wendy,
Yep, still here.
how are we doing?
Great.
Where should we go next? We got the background pretty well done here. Should we talk about the relative importance of institutions and people? He said both. That's not...
I guess what I would say is I have found that it's more the people at the institutions that have always interested me.
Okay, that's great.
They've been at institutions, but institutions can run hot and cold, but people don't. The people continue to have their interests, and if it's, if it's a life path, you follow it. And certainly people don't do this for the money.
Right. When you look at the border, and you look at both the past and the future, you talk mainly about collaboration and progress, and when bad things happen, they tend to be the fence, the highway, population thing, but I don't hear you say much about bad guys. Now, you're not untypical in that regard, but in your mind, in thinking about this, do you have even the Border Patrol, you said nice things about, that they were treating the land better than they once did? Do you see, in your mind, do you have a list of the enemy, or do you think about
the enemy today is, without much doubt, the people who are carrying guns and are likely to rob you or kill you. And as I said, there are areas where you no longer go.
Right.
And this is, as I don't know where all this stuff is going. I don't know how many people are, but it's certainly value-added agricultural products certainly outnumbers economically anything else that crosses the border right now, it seems like. And I think that until the United States grows up and decriminalizes and takes a big profit out of the drugs, I don't see there's any change. Mexico seems to be losing the war.
Yeah.
And I mean, we think about war in war in Angola and Afghanistan, and the horrors going across other actual nations, fighting nations. But there's a war right now, and I don't think that our government or our population is innocent.
Right.
Yes, it has created, I've known people who have been killed. And, Chuck Bowden ought to be governor.
All right, but overall, nonetheless, you think in the long term you're optimistic about...
No.
Okay.
I think that one of my other interests that this probably isn't the venue, but my other interest is the relationship of population to war, peace, and the survival of the planet. And I think it's going to be a long time before a population is stabilized. I don't see that happening, and much of this is a result of that.
Yes.
So I guess what you have to do, if you have the power, is to work around it or with it. The border has changed, and as far as bad guys, I mean, it used to be that I really did not want to meet up with U.S. Border Patrol people out in the field. Just did not. I can tell you some funny stories. And you would avoid them. Now I don't avoid them. I don't fear them. I had some fear of them in the past, of being hassled. I have been hassled unnecessarily. But as I said, there's much more professionalism. There is professionalism, and Bill Broyles would know this. Now, I haven't mentioned his name yet. He's been an enormous influence in my life, and I owe much to him. You don't fear U.S. Border Patrol. On the other side, anybody carrying a gun, you avoid. You don't know who the bad guys and the good guys are. As far as other bad guys, I don't know. Bad people. There are plenty of bad people who were right here at the University of Arizona. Professors whose names I won't mention, SOBs.
We might even agree about that.
And students, and I mean, in any one thing I've learned that and this bears on this. People would say, "Oh, well, the Saris, are they intelligent, or are they, are they all good? Are they good people, or they're just like anybody else? There's SOBs, and there's jerks, and there's stupids, and there are brilliants and wonderful. You always hope the last part outweighs the rest of it, but they're just like everyone else. There's a spectrum of nice people and interesting people." And
well, I had a reason to ask the question. We have currently a pretty negative discourse about Mexico and Mexicans in the state of Arizona, with this notion that everyone who comes across is by definition an illegal. Often that kind of polarizing talk fosters more polarizing talk, and it just sounds to me as if you're not going to go there.
I'm not going to go there, and I don't have strong enough words to say my fear. To me, what is going on now has emanated in some of the recent laws that we know about. It reminds me of the end of the Weimar Republic in Germany in the first days of Nazism, and I have no other words to put to that. It is exactly parallel.
Great.
And it is not, by the way, Mexico, even in the 30s, was not innocent in that part, as you know. The governor of Sonora in the 30s, his role model was Hitler. And you speak to any Chinese people here, and you will know what that means with the pogroms of the Chinese. Most of us are here because we have had to leave. Not maybe us, but our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. And we have left situations like that. I think what is happening, we've seen it before, and I know and I have seen how quickly political situations will turn, and how quickly situations will turn into genocide. I've been in India where things have been peaceful. The next day, babies are smashed on the railroad tracks, places where you can walk around with no fear of police, and then violence of that sort erupts. I think what is going on in Arizona is the single most dangerous thing that has happened in this country.
National parks and monuments, the thing that's going to protect the land, Or do you think that it's going to be these networks that we've talked about here of people who've now grown to be 1,000 strong or 10,000 strong, of people who care about the sea turtles or who care about the plants or who are deeply informed, including the
Well, my answer to that very strongly is both.
Okay,
Without the reserves, you can have as many people interested as possible,
Right.
but it won't do any good because you don't have anything to work with.
okay.
The reserves, just making a reserve in the days of Teddy Roosevelt, in the earliest days, the days of making a reserve and that being enough are over.
Okay.
Reserves don't remain as reserves unless they're actively managed, and that also usually means having a strong constituency,
Okay.
both with scientists, both the researchers and the public and the concerned public. I think it's great that we got these great reserves. The great reserves that now stretch from literally the outskirts of Phoenix to the Sonoran Desert National Monument, which is amazing that we got that.
It is.
And I would say that Bill Broyles was one of the persons who made that really, and the people surrounding him, and many, many other people, all the way through to Baja California, the Gulf of California, and the military lands. As I said, times have changed. The military is no longer the enemy of the environmentalists, of the green, and the Border Patrol is no longer the enemy. And I see a lot of hope. I see a lot of problems.
Right.
I don't think holding on, just having reserves is not enough. One has to be extremely proactive.
Okay. So,
I'd
can
like-
I just ask you directly while we're very
But
much
I'd like
on
to-
tape here?
I'd like to add one more thing
Okay,
to that.
go ahead.
One thing, and I kind of knew this, but it was Ezekiel Escura who really brought this home. Without researchers, without research going on, you don't get reserves made. Reserves are made from what is known. Reserves are made from what is known, and reserves are kept by active research. And those are the building blocks. I've seen way too much in the way of funding of conservation. Well, we fund conservation, we don't fund research. Or we fund research, we don't fund conservation. There just isn't a difference there. And so it's the presence of researchers that really brings the issues to the foreground. And anyone doing research out in the field today is a conservationist. Okay, I'm
Great,
sorry.
great. No,
yeah.
that's great. In fact, that's a very quotable quote, which causes me to ask you a question. We promised people we interviewed anonymity, but it would be just very helpful if we could pick out a quote from here and there of what you've said, and if we pass it by you, will you take a look at it? Can we do that?
I will, and if I don't respond, you have my permission to do whatever you want.
Excellent. Okay.
And call me whatever you want.
That's well.
I've been called worse.
Gwen, have you got anything else?
No, I don't think so. I was trying to think of some of the things that Bill Broyles had, and
He gave us a
Alberto
long-
Burquez had.
Yeah, we
in
got
the
some
draft.
very
Yeah,
nice,
Kind of the
both,
areas of.
Those are two people that I have not mentioned. I really should.
go, yeah, Broyles and Burquez, right?
Alberto Burquez and his wife Angelita, they've, and many of the other researchers also in Hermosillo, but they've been very open. And I've stayed with their house, and we've had a lot of fun together. And they've been very open, along with many other researchers, people who we haven't even mentioned in Guaymas. And Bill Broyles, actually, most of my work had been on the Mexican side, and Bill Broyles took me on one wonderful trip in June, mid-June. We went across Oregon Pipe, across the Cabeza Prieta to Nahas Altus, and you know about mid-June out there, and I didn't even know it was hot. It was so wonderful. And Bill really opened up my eyes to what was right under my nose. And also, I don't quite know how to say it, but there are not many people who are always as nice as he is.
Isn't he a nice person?
Yes, I'd say Bill Broyles and Ezekiel Oscura. Bill has, as I said, he's a great historian. He's not like the rest of us. He's so damn modest.
Yes, he is.
And bright. And so.
And he's a very good colleague. He gave us a great many critical and very useful comments on what we sent.
Well, he's probably better than I am as far as interviews, because he has done many interviews. He's been an interviewer.
We've gotten a little better at it, believe it or not.
So
Richard,
yes.
one of the things that Alberto had sort of queried, because we've sent a draft, early draft out for some internal comments. One of the things that Alberto had raised was this notion of scientists being objective and not necessarily activists. And I know that's, just in listening to you again and knowing a bit about your work, I know that's sort of a line that you've kind of worked with as well. Could you give us maybe a little idea about your thoughts around that?
Well, you have to be objective. In other words, science should be replicable or should be verifiable. And science, you really do look at the details and, then draw your generalizations from there. And as far as, what was the other aspect?
Well, just that activism
activism, yes. Yeah, well, in conservation and activism, to be really powerful, you want to have it science-based. You want to have it factual. If you are making pronouncements for the reasons for supporting conservation, and it cannot be verified, you're in deep doo-doo. If you're going to say, if we don't save this population, the whole ecosystem is going to collapse, well, maybe that one population becomes extinct and that population does not, and that ecosystem does not collapse. So those sorts of things, you have to, if you're, probably in conservation, you really have to touch on emotion. And I think, though, that conservation today is hardwired into our genotypes for survival of our resources that support our species. So you can say that that's emotional, but I think it's also in our genotype. But as I said, to really be powerful in conservation, it needs to be science-based. But you are going to have to, pull those emotional strings, which are probably the strongest ones are hardwired genetics.
That's great. Did you want to add something now, or would you rather I waited? No. Okay.
So I hope this might be a little bit useful.
This is wonderfully useful. Are we done?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks
You're
a
very
bunch.
welcome. And Wendy, I sure hope to catch up with you sometime.
I'd love to see you in person.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get to New Mexico sometime soon.
Well, Silver City is a wonderful place. I tell you what's great about it. There are no malls.
Must be colder though, Richard.
Oh, it's not that cold. And when it does get cold, it's a good time to go do some research in the Pinacate or Isla Tiburon.
Did you know I
There you
began my whole
go.
research in Silver City? I did.
Let's talk more about
Yeah,
that.
okay. Talk to you later, Gwen. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye, Richard. Take care.
Bye. Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot. It's just funny how we think things are so far apart, and in fact, there's all these interconnections. That's one of the things that I've learned about this.
Well, one thing we didn't even talk about is a couple books that are now being reviewed or wending their way through some publications. I've gotten, well, maybe I've grown up a little bit, a little more interested in the people.
Yeah.
And on so many herbarium labels, you see A.L. Smith, who is A and who is L, and who's student, and you start to put those things together and you see more.
Yes.
And
the sort of genealogy of these students, who they were students of, it's just amazing how many people are touched by one or two people, and it just sort of ripples out. It's
Yeah.
been amazing, particularly in this area.
Okay,
And somebody referred to it as a backwater, but you know, in some sense,
backwater.
well, they said, you know, there are people in New York who are interested in Mexico City, and they have these international environmental agendas, and the people who are interested in the border are really removed from that, and maybe that's a good thing.
Well, I think people in New York are probably going to have an easier time to communicate with Chilangolandos, and I think that we are here in Silver City and in Tucson and Flagstaff are more able to talk to people in Baja California and Sonora.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
Yeah.
And that maybe it is that trusting interconnection and relationship that makes this group so robust. We're not flying off in all directions and every time getting discouraged and everybody wanders away.
I think about help me with Jan Bauer's title for her biography of Shreve, Sense of Place.
Yes. Yes.
And Gary Nabhan is really,
Really.
he's really done that beautifully.
He has. Shouldn't have turned off my recorder because this last step's really important. I
Well, turn it
believe
off, yeah.
I believe this is really important.
Tell me more about Silver City. And you were,
Well, when I was an assistant professor struggling along in the political science department at the University of Arizona, I decided to look at New Mexico's
Are you
role in
recording?
the Colorado River Basin Bill. And in that piece of legislation, the state of New Mexico blocked the Central Arizona project in order to get rights on the Gila. And the environmentalists were really concerned about the state of New Mexico and the Bureau of Reclamation putting a dam on the Gila.
Yes.
So there was a big argument about the Connors site. And
well, that's not over with, you know.
no, it's now raised its ugly head again.
And I'm in the thick of it.
Well, I'd love to, you know, in some sense.
Would you come to the conference?
Yes, I would love to.
Okay, I'll give you the brochure. Mid-October, Ezekiel's going to be the keynote talk.
Wow.
Yeah,
I'll sure try. My daughter's coming to work on our book, so when the middle is, do you have a date?
yeah, I'll give you the brochure.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, I don't want to take any more of these.
You're not
nice people's time.
taking up our time.
Okay, all right. Well, this has been wonderful. Really, thank you
You know,
so much.
Silver City is infested with academics.
Yes. And I'm trying to remember the lawyer at the law school at UNM. I know her name well. I just have been thinking about our stuff, so I'm not, who is so interested in this. And she wants to take that little book that I had written all those years ago and update it with contemporary stuff. Oh,
Well, I probably wouldn't.
You
You know,
should
I have a
probably
problem with people's names because
I
then
do
you
too. Well, then you-
because then you forget a plant name.
I don't even have that excuse. Yeah. But, you know, that is fascinating because the historical roots of that are so important.
Well, I'll try to get you some of our, and maybe in the book that Ben Wilder and I are, it's in review now, University of New Mexico Press, on the vegetation of Flora, the islands, the Gulf of California. We have a large section on people, researchers,
Oh, that's
botanists.
so great.
And in fact, there's one paper just coming out now on Isla San Pedro Martir, and we were able to keep in the section about the people.
Great.
And you know, it's not easy to get that information.
No, it's very difficult.
Because people who were your professors or you knew back then, we can't go talk to Julian Hayden.
No,
We can't go talk to George Lindsay. And, yeah,
Or Paul Martin,
Pearl Mountain.
who is somebody else who comes up all the time in these.
Oh, yeah.
But there are
You know,
Bill
I
Shaw
went to Madagascar with Paul. I spent a
Ed
summer.
Glenn has all these students. There are been,
Yeah.
I mean, there are.
You know, I'm working in the thick with Ed Glenn on, well, yeah, you were here yesterday.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of that is not just people, it's where they were, what they collected. Often, for instance, on Isla Tiburon, you know how complex that is. It's 36 miles long, and mountains, and where something came from. And you get back into the early logs, you find that these people went on field trips together because you find the same date, but they don't have the other names on the labels. And then you find that, and then we figured out one thing, it was 1911, that's where the boat went. So that's where the specimens were from. And those things, they're all small things, but they add up.
Yeah, they do.
And it's, yeah.
Well, that's what this has been about. Bill's not very happy with this because he likes it to be less about people and more about parks and more about Bill Broyles. He just wishes, he thinks we're overdoing this network stuff. I mean, he does. He thinks we're overdoing it. We're making too big a deal out of it. But you know, it's a hopeful thing at a time when people-to-people relationships and everybody's being so polemic.
Well, sometimes I don't agree with Bill, but he's still my best friend.